Chapter 31. The Dark of the Moon and Moon Blood. Much of what comes to us from Great Mother mythology is her aspect as Terrible Mother. Historians and psychoanalytical researchers stress this aspect as though it illustrates the darkness and savagery of all those millennia of unenlightened by patriarchal order. There was blood sacrifice, but nothing approaching the scale of patriarchal mass murder. Nor was the sacrifice wanton. It was highly ritualized, and the people believed that there were deep reasons for it. Our human ancestors could not have survived the millennia as brutal savages, nor could they have created all of the seeds of all the cultures that followed unless they were highly complex beings. To know them, to know our own history as earthlings, we need to understand their complexity and their reasoning. The ancient people believed that the fetus was entirely formed in fat and blood, and this was why women didn't menstruate during their pregnancies. This perception was half correct, though the entire menstrual cycle is only recently understood. Menstrual blood was valued for its power. African and Australian Aboriginal people painted themselves red and poured blood on the sacred stones, celebrating the menstrual power of the Moon Mother. The great and terrible goddess mother of India, Kali, was covered in blood-stained clothes during her monthly periods, and these garments were prized as strong medicine. Kali's devotees also slashed themselves and covered her statues with their blood. These ceremonies still occur in India. Expanding on the perceived power of menstrual blood, it was believed that the mother as earth body needed strengthening and renewal through blood sacrifice. As her blood created creatures, so the blood of creatures was cycled back to her. What was taken from her by human in the form of harvest had to be returned in human or animal sacrifice. So the Neolithic funeral rites were not only connected with the deaths of human beings, but also acknowledged the death of all earth vegetation. Blood sacrifice and sexual rites were interwoven with the mourning of the dead, plowing the fields, harvesting crops, all to aid the rebirth of the seed in the dead body, through the ritual renewing of the Great Mother, through the mingling of blood, sex, and spirit. The moon also is seen as weakened and devoured by the powers of darkness during its waning phase. The dark of the moon came to symbolize the awesome underworld. Ancient Hindus believed the dark moon descended to earth to wait in sacrificial place. These 2 to 3 nights of darkness are full of terrible power, as darkness and the bleeding time of women. During the time, humans once fasted and prayed and performed rites to keep themselves concentrated and intact during the passage of darkness. In later Neolithic times, some cultures saw the moon as male and the sun lover of the goddess. As the vegetation deity died once each year to fertilize the crops with his blood, so the male moon god died each month. He disappeared for 3 days, locked up in her underworld. This myth was continued in the ritual of Christ being closed up 3 days in the tomb. In Polynesian belief, the dying moon journeyed to a faraway paradise where it was bathed in waters of immortality and restored to vigor, returned in 3 days. Mother goddesses of Mexico and Central America contain very clearly this double aspect of continuing life as the fruit of death and vice versa. Among the Mayans, the primordial gods were bisexual, Lord and the mistress of the two. Earth and night sky were the original unity, but the earth goddess falls from her embrace with the dark heaven and is torn asunder. From her 2 halves have come heaven and earth. By this painful rending, she becomes the source of all life, all food, but she also thereby becomes the terrible mother. Sometimes the earth goddess cried out in the night, demanding human hearts, and then she would not be comforted until she had given human blood to drink. Strong evidence suggests that the mass human sacrifice among Mayans and Aztecs, in particular the offering of hearts in the sun, was a late development, initiated by the warrior and priest classes under a militant patriarchy. Blood sacrifice occurred worldwide. We never know for sure how much of it occurred within goddess worship and how much was attributed to the mother goddess religion by later male oriented priesthoods. Mass human sacrifice is definitely linked everywhere with the ruling priest and warrior classes and elite male service to a sun god. Individual sacrifice, often voluntarily, undoubtedly occurred under the Great Mother, under the moon, and it occurred only among settled agricultural people. Why? Because settled agricultural people during the Neolithic were taking control of the growing processes of earth. They were deliberately planting, deliberately raping. And they felt that this intentional use of the mother's body might be a violation. It needed propitiation, which in the form of acknowledgement of use. Their need was for rebalancing, for reharmonizing above all. The Mayan earth goddess gives all life, all food, and then cries out in the human night for human blood, her food. Here, at the place of origin, is a profound fusion of positive and negative symbols, and this is always related to food. Not to sex, but to food, which is the first taboo. Sex does not require an act of death, an act of murder for its fulfillment, but eating does. And from the beginning, there was a primary human perception that our living is sustained by death, by the death of all other life forms, animal or vegetable. For all of the world was seen to be alive, and humans lived by eating the world. The mother's creatures lived by eating each other within her body. There is a kind of ontological pain in this perception that can be resolved only through ritual, which was always a fusion of sex and eating and fertility of life and death, and vice versa. In fertility ritual, as in funeral rites, sex and nourishment are related through the ritual cannibalism. The constant recycling of life through death and back again dramatically signifies a human need to harmonize those poles, especially the woman's need to harmonize our production of children with their consumption of food. This harmonization was always a major concern of women's religion. It is only after the introduction of the patriarchal sun cult that the polar symbols of eating and sex became irreconcilable. Under patriarchal control, child production and food consumption have never been in harmony for long, and so mass human sacrifice appears via religious or ritual or warfare as the sun gods attempt to harmonize them. In Mayan mythology, after the symbolic one tree of the original home, the one body of the original bisexual being has been shattered into separate spheres. The primal mother is dismembered to become the source of all life. Later, she was further personified as the corn daughter, and women were sacrificed as her after several days of ritual in which she blessed the crops. The woman's body slain by the obsidian knife, the ritual knife itself, and the priestly hand wielding it were all seen as her. The husking of corn was the same as tearing out of the ritual victim's heart. Mating, renewal of vegetation through the sex act, and ritual killing of the corn daughter were identical. Death and fecundation, symbolically one. Fecundation relates to sex, and death relates to eating. The human heart becomes the food of the earth mother for the sun god. In the cult of the Mayan mother, under the later priesthood, prisoners were shot with arrows symbolizing sexual union with earth. Just as in Paleolithic caves, the hunter shaman's penis spear united with the vulva wound to guarantee the rebirth of slain animals. Prisoners were shot in the genital region, or they were killed in the fetal position, tied up with the foodstuff rope. This rope was an umbilical cord attaching the prisoner victim to the center of the stone, which represented the center and entrance place, the womb of the earth. Both Mayans and Aztecs had a goddess who died in childbirth. She was the young moon goddess, daughter of the primal mother of the beginning. The souls of women who died in childbirth went to live in the West, where the moon and the sun both die, along with the souls of heroic warriors who died in battle. Identity was seen between the birth of the cutting out of the hearts. Mayan art showed simultaneous scenes of human sacrifice and birth. All such images are attempts to symbolize the continuous feeding of a process, the continuous process of feeding. Life feeding Life feeding death, which feeds life. The mother goddess dies to become food for life. Her children, her daughters, the corn maiden, or as moon especially, die to feed her. Another way to show this concept is through the two-headed goddess, the Mexican Coatlicue. The colossal Aztec statue of Coatlicue fuses in one image the dual functions of the earth, which both creates and destroys. In different aspects, she represents Coatlicue, Lady of the Skirt Serpents, or the goddess of the serpent petticoat. Coatlicue, the serpent woman, Sletzicatl, goddess of filth and redemption, and Tomazin, our mother, was later sanctified by the Catholic Church as the Virgin of Guadalupe, the dark-faced Madonna, La Virgen Morena, the Virgin Guadalupana, the patroness and protectress of New Spain, and who is still the patroness of all Indian Mexico. And the statue of her head is severed from her body, and from the neck flow of serpents girdled by another serpent as a belt. On her breast hangs a necklace in human hearts and hands bearing a human skull as a pendant. Her hands and feet are shaped like claws. From the bisophilous mass, which takes the place of a head and which represents Omescan, the topmost heaven, to the world of the dead extending below the feet, the statue embraces both life and death. Squat and massive, the monumental 12-ton sculpture embodies pyramidal, cruciform, and human forms. As the art critic Justinio Fernandez writes in his oft-quoted description, it represents not a being but an idea, the embodiment of the cosmic dynamic power which bestows life and which thrives on death in the struggle of opposites. The resemblance between the Aztec Coatlicue and the Hindu Kali, including their names, is profound. They represent the same primal perception, the continuity of life-death. However strange or terrible, i.e., causing terror, such rites and icons might seem, they show the original human mind trying to come to terms with the paradoxical reality of the primal mother. She who bleeds with both life and death. She who dies and returns again cyclically. She who gives us all to each other as food, as bloodkin, as co-creators of our ecstasies, of our deconstructions. As Carlos Fuentes in Terra Nostra, Terra and terror are related. They have the same origin because the source of life and the source of death are the same. And this is both a frightening and an awesome recognition. It is very hard to endure without ritual resolution. Moderns who neither kill nor grow their own food, nor bury their own dead would seem to have solved the problem by avoiding it. But in fact, the resolution is simply delegated nowadays to nightmares, slaughterhouses, torture rooms, and death squads, and in snuff films, in which criminal priests perform obscene sacrifices to the gods of displaced responsibility. No one can truly avoid the paradox of life-death as one continuous god or process. Such a perception arises from the deepest labyrinth of our psyches, where there is no distinction between primitive and modern. The only difference is that primitives strive to be conscious of the paradox, moderns strive to escape it. But the paradox shows us an ontological maze that we cannot sanely deny, destroy, or overleap. We have to learn to walk it again, to dance it as our ancestors did, with grace, strength, and awful wisdom. The goddess in her death aspect is the earth in which things rot, the devourer of the dead bodies, the great underground vessel. The Eleusinian mysteries of the ancient Aegeans, Cretans, and Egyptians contain symbolism of the burial of the dead in great stone jars, the pithoi, as grain seed was buried and stored under the earth. Women were the keepers of the seed jars and of the dead. The black night sky was also identified with water and with the devouring darkness of the underground. Hell, the abode of the dead, was entered through the all-eating mouth cavern of the earth. Helle was a Scandinavian Germanic goddess of the living dead. The womb was hungry mouth, organ of cannibalistic life and death. The hungry earth mouth takes the blood seed of living creatures and once fertilized gives birth again by way of death. The point to be made is that the ancient people had no trouble cognizing these dual or polar aspects of the one goddess, these two faces of the same source. They had no trouble so long as their lives remained bound up on a daily basis with the cycling paradox of the earthly process, where food is born from the sleeping ground of the dead, where the tomb of death and the womb of life are one and female. In late Neolithic times, the death aspect of the goddess broke loose, became dominant and morbid. Women's industries in settled village had prospered, had grown into city-state cultures with complex social organization and removal of religious function from daily life, creating specialized labor and hierarchic structures. The creation of surplus wealth gave rise to the profession of moritor. Males no longer employed as hunters began organizing more and more professionally together and separately from the women as grain guardians, then armies, then urban police, then imperial plunderers. The great goddess was still worshipped into the Bronze Age, but increasingly by an urban male priesthood and an urbanized populace once removed from the real earth. Between producer and consumer, ruler and ruled, living and dead, sacred and daily life, there was a growing gap, call it urban secular life, historically filled with the structures of nervous alienation and psychological personal fears. This marks the rise of patriarchal consciousness, in which humans experience earth magic and cyclic process less and less in their daily lives, and are forced to rely more and more on urban hierarchic priesthoods and specialists to give them secondhand words of faith and moral advice. When religion leaves the land, leaves ecstatic dance and prophetic chant, it becomes increasingly a matter of verbal exhortation, of moralistic rhetoric, where people are told what to feel and believe because they no longer feel and believe it. At the same time, male metallurgists were introducing a technology aimed at altering the natural powers and channels of the earth spirit. It detached from the goddess and was no longer a sacred art. It was being used to mass produce offensive war weaponry. The war machines of large bands of highly organized men were inventing the profession of conquest and plunder. The profession of imperialistic power, armed with rolling metal. This was the patriarchal shift. The Furies cried, he made man's way across the place of the ways of the goddess and blighted age-old distributions of power. Male priests concentrating more and more on the negative goddess. Once her devotees, they expressed increasingly obsessive fears of the sexual and death-dealing powers of the Great Mother. They did not, as women priestesses had always done, identify with the dark side. The Great Mother had always had her dark aspect, for this is the truth of the universe, and her priestess resolved it through the ritual expression of the fury. Under Bronze Age priesthoods, this aspect was projected morbidly and exploitatively, emphasized and unrelieved. No longer simultaneously experienced the luminous benevolence, beauty, and rightness of the mother's natural world, the male priest began to rule by fear alone. Fear of death, fear of female sexuality, fear of natural process. Thus, the Great Mother became dark, all-devouring time. She was depicted as the bone-wretched lady of the place of skulls, smeared with ashes, squatting among jackals and bats in the burial grounds. Served in bloody rites, Kali had many names, all negative, all bad times, and the human cycle are named for her, the Kali Yuga. Statues show her crouching in a halo of flames, devouring the entrails of her mate Shiva, the gut strung from the corpse of her mouth like an umbilical cord. Kali's temple in India functions as the people's slaughterhouse. The people take the meat and the blood is left to her. Everyone has seen this Kali, the Black Mother. She dances on Shiva's dead body, wearing a necklace of her tongue rolled grotesquely out to lap up the human blood from the ground. All creation is the sport of Mad Mother Kali, said the Hindu poet Ramprasad. She also has her benevolent aspect, but the functions become increasingly severed. Paradox is split into dualism, an active characteristic of patriarchal consciousness. No doubt, as men engaged more and more in wanton slaughter of their own kind for plunder and power, they needed to project this split in their own psyches onto the goddess. The benevolent Kali becomes virtually a separate pale goddess, a passive mother, a sex partner without power. At her best, she is the divine Shakti, the creative energy of the male god, coming into manifestation in the moment of sexual union with Shiva. The Bronze Age Kali is split into the death goddess and the sex goddess, or the mother goddess, but she is no longer the one cosmic process containing all aspects and polarities. And it is only as the terrible destroyer, time, that she has any authority or power left. Hair has always been connected with the idea of cosmic power. Hair is electric radiating energy, a symbol of vitality and a spiritual illumination. Witches believed their magic power was in their hair. During the European witch hunts, the first thing the church did to capture witches was to shave them head to foot, driving out the devil power that lived in their body hair. American Indians fought hair clipping missionaries for centuries. To mourn a dead person, the hair was cut, signifying a life offering to death. With the increase of urban priesthoods and the unbalanced obsession with the death aspect of the Great Mother, the more we find symbolic connections occurring between death and the shaving of the head, sacrifice, and castration. The priests of Isis had bald heads. And still today, we have tonsured monks, shorn nuns, and the Christian notion that a woman's hair is seductive, witchy, insult to God that must be covered in his church. And thus, traditional Jewish brides cut off their long, glorious hair, sacrificing original female power to be subordinate to a male in marriage. Among the Greeks, the goddess of the dark moon was Hecate. She was the queen of the ghosts and the crossroads, where many midnight rituals took place. Hecate was the destroyer. Newborn children and animals were sacrificed to her. She was the giver of rain as well as the harvest storms. Her major festival was celebrated on August 13th. In one Hecate legend, the mother in her terrible aspect takes the form of a bear or a boat, killing her own son lover. But as the new moon restores him to new life. Dark Diana of the Romans, goddesses of the witches, wore a necklace of testicles, echoing the castration nature of Kali. And the Gorgon Medusa, her magic hair composed of writhing snakes, petrified all who looked into rigidity and death, into stone. Thus, many of the primal aspects of the cosmic mother were turned into aspects of the enemy. But from the beginning, and even far into patriarchal times, the dark of the moon symbolized divination, illumination, and the powers of healing. Soma, the mind-expanding potion, was the dark fruit of the moon tree. It opened the gaping depths of darkness from which magic incantation rises up. Darkness is the time of tactility and of the voice. So, the dark goddess or dark moon presided over love, magic, metamorphosis, wonder working, and medicinal healing. Her sexual aspect was not separated from these other powers until the solidification of the patriarchy. Only then was she fragmented and reduced to simply a sex goddess or the wife. The Neolithic Near East goddess Isis, Astarte, Aslareth, Ishtar, Artemis, Diana, all have their dark nature, one half of the cosmic process. In that aspect, they're imagined as a half snake or half fish. The men who were and are in opposition to her ever-changing cyclic nature, she appears dreadful, hostile, arbitrarily destructive, moody, or negative. The yawning mouth of the womb tomb, abysmally prolific with children and with death, threatening castration and coming and going. During the Neolithic age, men who saw the dark moon goddess in a dream had to put on women's clothes and give themselves to other men. The dream image was a message that they needed rebalancing. To women and men in accord with her nature, she gives magic power and cosmic insight into the life process, forever resolving from light into dark and back again. From earliest Stone Age times, the process of birth was the prototype and process of spiritual rebirth, of higher rebirth into the heavens as an immortal or star. But with the increasing male domination of religious ideas, the priestly projection of hostile fears into the great goddess, this higher birth was seen as increasingly as a break away from the mother. The first birth was into mere flesh, but the second was into manhood, a state of non-material immortality uncontaminated by the female process. At this point, the spirit begins to be defined as everything that is not earth, is not nature, is not female, and becomes an exclusive possession of males, as an elitist, as it is abstract. In the early small kin group structures, the custom of exami had led women to take mates from outside the mother clan so that childbearing women were always the cohesive group within the community. Their mates tended to be visitors, blood strangers to the matrifocal group. Among the matriarchal Hopi, where the women propose marriage to the men, the husband moves into the woman's home, which she inherits from her mother, and he spends most of his time at his mother's home, where he is blood related. The same customs were found throughout the pre-colonial Africa, and no doubt existed among all our European pagan ancestors. To gain some cohesion and sense of participation, these outside males bonded together in rituals which they imitated female processes. As Bruno Bettelheim writes in Symbolic Wounds, it is probable that all men's initiation rites were originally based on the men's desire to imitate, to participate in women's menstruation and childbirth, which were overwhelmingly magical events. Magic because their periodicity as well as their blood power. Australian Aboriginal males have wounds in their penises, inserting stones to keep the womb permanently open. This rite imitates female bleeding, and the wound is called in their language a vagina. During this rite, young men pass through the legs of older men, being reborn from the male womb. Nowhere can we find any rites or mysteries in which women have tried to imitate a male process or function. This alone tells about the source of original mana or power. All blood rituals derive from the female blood of menstruation and childbirth. This is why in the Bible, Jehovah's covenant with Abraham was ritually sealed with the lifeblood of Abraham. And this covenant was kept by circumcising the foreskin of every Hebraic male infant. The Hebrews, like everyone else, were originally goddess worshippers. And it was her magic blood that systematically sealed covenants. As the patriarchy solidified its power, however, many of the blood ritual imitations of women's functions were turned into taboos against women's functions, taboos of avoidance and hygiene. As the biblical Old Testament illustrates, patriarchy society places heavy taboos and penalties of shame on menstruation and on women during and after childbirth. Such taboos were originally restrictions made by women themselves. Menstrual bodies and guarantee their sacred solitude during the moon functions and their separateness from men and children. But as male power structures and religious reactions against the goddess rise, seeing the great mother more and more as the castrating other, the terrible devourer, these moon blood taboos are given negative connotations. Women during their menstrual periods and childbirth are defined as unclean and dangerous, especially threatening to social manhood, and its co-opted assumptions of sacred powers through the second ritual birth via an elder male body. The female body, which actually does these things, becomes an embarrassing threat to the male's metaphorical assumption of blood powers in menstruation and childbirth. No male priest can compete with a woman in these areas. So the menstruating woman is often totally excluded from group life, cast out into the bush or forest to fend for herself. She must be ritually cleansed before she can return to the tribe. Women in labor must also be secluded to protect men from contamination and must undergo periods of purification following childbirth. Among biblical Hebrews, a longer period following the birth of a daughter, of course, than a son. What was once seen among original humans as sacred and magically powerful to the whole kin group or tribe becomes under male religion impure, filthy, dangerous, negative, and evil. The source of life, female, is redefined and now hated as the enemy of male life. What was once woman's power is now woman's curse, a woman's shame, woman's estrangement from God. In the Bible, we can see the original Orwellian newspeak occurring, in which false male imitations of menstruation and childbirth, the circumcised foreskin, the wounds of Christ, are made sacred and holy, while the real thing done by woman is made filthy, sinful, and bestial. This terrible and unnatural split in the human psyche is still with us, of course. Patriarchal religions are based on it. Under patriarchy, this split was projected everywhere, into the cosmic spiritual realms, into human culture and customs, into scientific perception of the mental and physical worlds. Under Bronze Age urban priesthoods, the terrible mother was worshipped more and more with painful rites and punitive exorcisms. She became, in fact, the debased flesh, which must be flailed and disciplined into submission, a religious practice that served very well as the rationalization for the mass exploitation of human slave labor by the growing urban states and their ruling elites. If human flesh and blood is nothing but, then by all means use it. With the devaluation of the Great Mother's female bleeding came the debasement and exploitation of human life itself. Women's menstrual blood always was, always is, of the essence of the creative power of the Great Mother. Blood is the physical counterpart of the mystical life force spiraling through the cosmos, nourishing the universe, sustaining its breathing in and out, its manifestations, and its dissolutions. Ancient women withdrew during their menstrual periods to meditate, fast, pray, and communicate with her. Women living together in cooperative groups do begin to coordinate the time of their period. Ancient women bled and meditated together under the bleeding and meditating moon. Even under the punitive taboos of patriarchy, women withdrew to their menstrual huts with some feeling of voluntary seclusion, a chance to get back in contact with their own nature a few days each month, apart from the demands of children and men. In Women's Mysteries, Ancient and Modern, Esther Harding suggests that one of the prime causes of neuroses, illness, and depression and pain suffered by many women in modern cultures during menstrual periods, the premenstrual syndrome especially, as it's known today, is that we now have no menstrual ceremony of any kind. Menstruation is just each woman's private affliction or annoyance. It has no positive value or function. We cannot withdraw into contemporary menstrual huts to listen to our bodies, minds, and needs, to reestablish contact with our cyclic and primal cosmic selves, to ourselves as sacred animals. And ironically, while being deprived of ritual solitude while we bleed, we are also isolated from the communion of other women who are bleeding. Each woman must go along through each life stage, transition, and crisis in silent aloneness, unsupported by either ritual or the woman's group. This combination of meaningless isolation and lack of ritual solitude is the final patriarchal taboo against women, a major cause of mental illness, and a major barrier against self-realization. Thus was woman's ancient collective power broken. Women under patriarchy, isolated from each other and from themselves, could no longer threaten male dominance of life or question male co-option and imitation of our original female processes. But some faint trace of the ancient beliefs and practices remain even in the modern world, even if in sometimes grotesque form. The continuing belief of the potency of women's menstrual blood is ritualized in the tantric yoga. A man can only reach the ultimate tantric goal by having intercourse with a woman power holder at the time of her menstruation. This is when her red energy is most magically potent and intense. And among American motorcycle gangs, like the Hells Angels, a male cannot become a full member until he performs the blood rite of cunnilingus with his woman during her menstrual period. This is how he proves his macho toughness to other males. He probably doesn't know that he is worshiping the Great Mother. From hidden dirty secret to symbol of the life power of the goddess, women's blood has come full circle. Until recently, there have been no books on the psychology of menstruation, the rhythms and cyclicity of women's lives. In 1970s, however, two such books were published. Female Cycles by Paula Whittiger, and in 1975, The Wise Wound, Menstruation in Every Woman by Penelope Shuttle and Peter Redgrove. In 1978, Paula Whittiger is an American feminist health worker and holds advanced degrees in psychology. Penelope Shuttle and Peter Redgrove are British poets influenced by Jungian psychoanalysis. They came to write their book as a result of Penelope Shuttle's own severe premenstrual depressions and her menstrual pains, and her attempts to find their reasons and cure through in-depth dream analysis. The two books complement each other. The Wise Wound is poetic and religious, while Female Cycles is more medical and immediately practical. Together, they chronicle the atrocious violence done to us women in societies ruled over and defined by wombless men who do not experience the lunar cyclic rhythmic rhythms in their bodies. The Wise Wound shows how the human female's menstrual cycle was the critical evolutionary advance that initiated human society and culture. As we said in the first section, the fact that the human female is freed from the estrous cycle of other primates means that women's sexuality is distinguishable from, separable from fertility, in women alone among all creatures on earth. This shifting of sexual hormonal action led to an increased alertness of the brain and its electrical activity, i.e., women have sexual energy at our disposal separable from reproductive energy. For women biology is not destiny in the narrow reproductive sense, even if patriarchy has tried, through the dogmatic suppression of our autonomous sexuality, to reverse this evolution. Patriarchal religion, in this sense, a primate religion trying to pull the human female body back in her evolutionary advance over other primates. For in this one aspect alone, does human sexuality differ from primate sexuality. And it is for this subliminal reason that all hardcore patriarchal fundamentalists oppose evolutionary theory so vehemently, because the godhead of human evolution, its trigger, its energy source, is and only can be female. The sole function of the clitoris is sexual pleasure, and it is the only organ in the human body devoted to pleasure alone, the penis carrying both reproductive semen and sexual response in every erotic act. This means that woman's sexual capacity is enormously enhanced and multiple. And it is present in us from birth to death, clitoral sensation being determined neither by puberty nor menopause. When freed, women's autonomous sexual capacity is a great source of psychic, productive, creative, and magical powers. It was at the origins of human culture, and it is necessary to any further human evolutionary advance. Human life and evolution are explained in many ways. We are indeed producers and tool makers, as the Marxists and anthropologists say, and creators of symbolic culture. But we were not human until the appearance of the menstrual cycle. With it came the possibility of all evolutionary developments that are specifically human: extraction of mental energy from reproduction and survival, social bonding through human emotion, symbolism, symbols or mental childbirth, recognition and valuing of the individual as a being with rights to pleasure and subjective exploration, social organization and sexual affection, leading to the development of cultural and economic cooperation for the purpose of enhancing rather than just in experiencing and maintaining the human experience. Otherwise, why evolve? Women have got to understand the importance of the switch from primate estrus to the human menstrual cycle, because this was the mechanism of human evolution. It is also the target of patriarchy. Female sexuality and female evolution have been, for 2 or 3 millennia at least, in a lethal deadlock with patriarchal ideology, religious, economic, and political. This is because patriarchy as a system wants to enforce and maintain male primate power, dominance, control over our species. The rise of patriarchy was an evolutionary step backwards in this sense. The only thing blocking or neutralizing this patriarchal primate urge towards dominance control of the human species is the more advanced capacity for human creative communal process via social sexual bonding evolved by women of our species, i.e., we are still trying to evolve from the primate to the fully human. In this long attempt, autonomous female sexuality represents an advance, while patriarchal control over female sexual process represents regression. This is why all patriarchal religions try to define menstrual and childbirth blood, the source of life, as filth, a shame, and a crime, because it represents the creative power of the evolutionary female. She who, as Judy Grant said, she who, with her blood, created the human world.